Hi everybody, this is Katje Eckhart. Welcome to my YouTube channel. This evening I want to have a little bit of fun and mix things up by talking about one of my favorite artists of all times. This is an artist named Cy Twombly, who passed away unfortunately a few years ago. He was born in Lexington, Virginia and lived in New York. Also lived in Paris. I believe he lived in Rome. I'm not sure about Paris, but definitely in Rome. And he was active throughout most of the mid-20th century on into like the 1980s, 1990s. So he's really a mid-20th century artist who was influenced somewhat by abstract expressionism, but also developed his own very unique style, which I want to talk a little bit about this evening. And maybe at some point I will put a link to a page where you can see some of his paintings if you're not familiar with them. A lot of his paintings combine both the brush strokes, the paint, but also drawing, scribbling, very complex fields of symbols, of characters, of marks that are almost bewildering but very, very interesting. So what I want to do this evening is I want to offer a personal interpretation of at least part of one of the paintings that he made on New Year's Eve 1959 into New Year's Day 1960, called The Age of Alexander. And I'm not going to go into a lot of detail because there's so much going on in that painting, as you will see if you get to peruse or look at an image of it. But what I want to do is just give you a sense of what some of this complexity is, and I also want to make a connection to some philosophical ideas in Nietzsche. Now, let me preface this with a caveat, and that is that I'm not trying to give a definitive interpretation of this work. I'm not trying to give a Rosetta Stone. I'm not trying to encrypt it and say, well, this is the only way of interpreting it. If I were doing that, that would be rather foolish because art doesn't really work that way. But what I am doing is saying that, or suggesting that the particular ideas that I want to mention this evening might be fruitful ways of looking at least some of this art and maybe helping you have a deeper appreciation of it. So let me begin by just saying a little bit about this painting and when Twombly made it, the conditions under which he made it. First of all, if you look at this painting, you will see that it is basically a large white or sort of off-white canvas, and that there's this swarm of scribbles and characters and sort of geometrical forms, numbers, this whole swarm of characters and figures occupying this canvas, moving in sort of a diagonal from the lower left-hand corner up into the upper right-hand corner. Again, it's hard for me to convey exactly how it looks. It would help if you were to see an image of it, and again, I may try to post a link to that later. But in any event, what the basic idea is that there's this swarm of characters, scribbles, etchings in the paint, figures, numbers, and so forth. Now, what does this all mean? And, you know, it kind of looks like almost like a private language. The occasion for Twombly's painting this work was that he was sort of I think he was attending a New Year's Eve party with his family and friends, and he was, I guess he got tired of that, or he was sort of shy and wanted to withdraw from that because he had this very powerful creative impulse, and so he, by himself in another room of the house, he unrolled this canvas across the entire length of a room and parted into another one, and proceeded in the last hours of 1959 and in the first moments of 1960 to paint this monumental work, The Age of Alexander, after Alexander the Conqueror, but also he had just recently, his wife had just given birth to a son. He recently married, and then they had a child, and he named this child Alexander. So there are a lot of things going on in Twombly's life here that feed into this creative impulse. His recent marriage, the birth of his son, he's reflecting on both life and death, birth and death. All of these kind of existential themes are probably running through his mind and his heart at the time that he paints and draws The Age of Alexander. So I think another thing that I want to suggest in my partial interpretation of this work is that it has to do with time and the passage of time, the relationship between the passage of time and our experience of things in time that seem to be enduring, but they do become subject to temporal change and they pass away into time. So let me just get right down to the heart of the matter and look at just a particular few images in this painting. So basically what you have is a whole lot of stuff going on. You have these figures that have like numbers that are indexing them. Sometimes the numbers occur on the outside of the figure, sometimes they occur on the inside. They're words. And so one way of trying to read your way into this painting is to find an entry point and then sort of use that as a fulcrum to move to other parts of the painting and interpret the particular symbols there in light of the fulcrum. So close to the middle of the painting, if you look at it, Twombly sketches something about death. He uses the word death, and right above that he has this very curious phrase, which is sad flight. Sad flight. So there's this reference to death and a sad flight, this kind of poetic reference in connection with death. And then if we continue above that and slightly up and to the left, there's this kind of bird-like figure. It has like three parts to it. One part might be its torso, and the other part look like wings. And within the wings, each wing has a number inside of it, and then there's a number on the outside of the third part. Now, one thing that I've noticed in Twombly's semiotics, or his symbology, or his sort of pictorial language at this point in his career, is that sometimes when a figure is partitioned, when it has different parts, and then there are numbers either in the parts or around it, that can help you read what it is, and it can also tell you something about the status of that particular figure or symbol or character. So let's just talk about it this case. So I think that in like one of the wings of the bird there's a 3, and another one there's a 2, and then on the outside of the whole thing there's a 1. Now let's keep that in mind against the backdrop of this reference to death and the sad flight that Twombly's poetic reference. And let's relate that to this bird-like symbol with the numbers in it. And what becomes clear, or what might become clear, is that this is the image of either a dead or a dying bird. It's no longer alive, or soon it will not be, and that as the partitions in this form become filled in with numbers, that's a sign that it's being used up, that's a sign that it's nearing completion, that's a sign that it's nearing or has reached death. And this is a very important theme that Twombly is engaging in the Age of Alexander. When you look at other symbols in the painting, which I'm not going to go into right now because it would take us too far afield, but there are similar moves that are made where, forms that either are partitioned or not, they're just simple forms, if they're filled with numbers, this seems to be Twombly's way of talking about things that have completely passed away. It could be a bird that's died, but it could also be like a mountain or a tree that has either eroded or died and decayed, and it's no longer here. It's completely passed away. So that for Twombly, in this very, very interesting work, it's like the passage of time is a way in which things actually become substantial. What we have now in the present and in the near future, we have a lot of experiences that might be connected to each other in interesting ways, but we don't really have things. We don't have things that are persisting and unchanging and unalterable until something has completely passed away, has completely faded away into the past, either through death, if it happens to be an animate, an organic thing, or if it's an inanimate or inorganic thing, simply through the process of erosion or some other kind of decomposition of its elements or whatever. It's no longer with us, like a rock that's been completely eroded away by the wind, leaving nothing but sand, perhaps. Now, what does this have to do with Nietzsche and Nietzsche's philosophy, what kind of connection might we make here? Well, one of the things that Nietzsche does in Guts und Dämmerung is criticize the notion of substances or enduring things, things that persist through change. In other words, you have the substance of a tree, and the substance is there, but its properties could change. So during the spring, the leaves might be green, and then in the fall, they might turn colors. But the tree, the substance, the thing, remains the same. Or the bird is a substance that its properties can undergo changes through time, but the substance itself doesn't until it goes out of existence. But it does, at some point, exist, and it doesn't change. The only thing that changes are the properties of the thing. So this is a metaphysical idea that Nietzsche goes after. Also, he goes after the idea that each one of us is a particular mental substance or a soul or something like that. Now, I'm not going to review his critique right now because, again, that would take us somewhat far afield. But what I think is interesting here, and what I recommend for your consideration, what I propose to you, is that in his own very artistic way, Twombly is kind of buttressing or echoing this Nietzschean critique. Now let me say exactly why I think that is, because I think it's fascinating, I really do. When we think about the metaphysics of substance, or the metaphysics of enduring things, these are things that are supposed to exist right now. They don't change. What changes, or at least if there is change, it's change in their properties, but the substance, the underlying subject, the underlying foundation that is the thing itself, or this object itself, or the substance itself, according to Aristotle and other people in the metaphysical tradition, that never changes until it goes out of existence. There can be a substantial change of one substance into another, but let's just talk about where we have a substance that itself doesn't change, but it undergoes change in the sense that its properties from one time to another may change. But during the present, it exists. It's there, and it's a non-changing, enduring thing. Now, what Twombly is saying, if I understand him with this bird symbol and other characters that you can find in the Age of Alexander, which is obsessed almost with the theme of time and how things pass away through it, is that something, when we think about something, we really want to understand the notion of something that never changes, that is enduring, and that persists. The only place that we find that, Twombly is suggesting, in an almost revolutionary and a kind of seditious way, if you will, he's suggesting that the only place we find that is when something is completely passed away. It no longer exists. Whether it is a living thing that has died and so completely gone away into the past, or passed away, to pun on the notion of time here, or maybe it's something inorganic like a rock that has completely eroded and so passed away. It's completely past. That's when we can make sense of something that doesn't change, something that the past cannot be changed. Things that have passed away completely cannot be changed. But the hitch is that they no longer exist. So the critique, it's a really interesting idea. The critique is that Twombly is suggesting that echoes Nietzsche is, well, look, the only place where we can really make sense of this idea of an underlying something that persists without changing is in terms of things that have already passed away, that have already moved completely into the past and are literally no longer with us. They no longer exist. That means that the Aristotelian or the metaphysical notion of an object that endures and exists right now doesn't make any sense. The only place where we can give any sense to the idea of endurance and persistence is with things that don't exist, namely things that are completely past. So that all we have now are a bunch of experiences that we can find more or less useful ways to connect with each other, to form views, to form patterns, but not substances, not things, nothing like that. Some of the useful ways might be science, math, but also art in the form of painting or drawing or music, world making. This is a term that the philosopher Nelson Goodman uses. that's something that's really going on in experience. But what Twombly is saying in a kind of Nietzschean vein, and that I think we can find in this work, The Age of Alexander, but also contemporaneous works like View or Studies for the Presence of Myth, Study for Presence of a Myth, I think that's the name of it, works from the late 50s and on into around 1960, we find a similar kind of critique or implied critique of this metaphysical idea of a persisting thing that exists right now. Twombly can't make any sense out of that. And what we have instead is simply more or less useful ways of connecting experiences together into views, and views together into a world that gives us a perspective, but at no point do we need any kind of or make sense out of any kind of substances or objects in the traditional sense. This is a subversive idea from the standpoint of the metaphysical tradition in Western philosophy. It's a very Nietzschean idea, and in Twombly's work, among other things, not suggesting that it's the only thing that's going on, but I am suggesting that it might be going on, and as you can see, I'm very excited about it. It's something that I want to explore further. I'm not sure that I'm completely ready to give up all the notion of existing things, although I would intend to give that a more theological interpretation, but that's not what we're talking about this evening. What we're talking about is how Twombly's art at a certain point in his career is very fruitfully understood as picking up on certain deep philosophical themes in Nietzsche and giving them a kind of pictorial depiction. I think it's very interesting. It's something that I might want to say a little bit more about in another video, but that's all I want to say tonight. I've been away for a few days because my spouse and I went to La Jolla, California for a short vacation. We had a very lovely time. We enjoyed good food, good weather, and good company and conversation with friends. So I'm glad to be home. I hope everybody is having a wonderful summer, a wonderful and beautiful late summer. It's a very magical time of year. It's also a time of transition. So until next time, I wish everybody a peaceful and a restful and a safe evening. Be good to each other. Take care of each other. I care for all of you, and I hope to talk to you again real soon. Thanks again for joining me. This is Katje saying goodbye.